Thank you, Michael, and hello everybody. What I want to do, and I'm going to be sharing a huge amount of data with you over the next 25 minutes or so. So bear with me because it'll be a fairly fast journey, always aiming for that live stream with the Minister as well. And the format that I'm going to take is I want to just very briefly dip into what's happening in the UK market, and then once we've done that, bring you through the journey of what's happened over the last 12 months, get the data out of the Barometer, and then maybe explore some of the next steps that we're taking. So first of all, let's look at the UK market. I guess it's a fact of life now that there's nobody who doesn't know this figure of 37% of our exports go to the UK. Obviously, 31% of them then go to the international markets, 32% of it go to continental Europe. But all of the time when we're seeing that, there's a story behind it, and there's a huge difference by sector. So one of the big messages that we'll have been got from the Barometer as well is the individual company, not just sector, that is driving the changes here. And even when you look at that sectoral piece to say, oh, 94% of our horticulture, particularly our mushrooms, is going to the UK, and isn't seafood fine because only 12% of seafood goes to the UK, nothing could be further from the truth. And I think testament that the Minister is down with the seafood industry in Galway today as they are looking at a worst case scenario of actually access to their fish or the quotas being revisited, which will have a huge impact on them in a bigger picture. So the figures have to be interpreted all of the time and understood to get the full story of what is Brexit. We've been talking, and what is Brexit to us over the first period was currency. It was the volatility that happened the day after the announcement, and that really hit everybody immediately. And I think mushrooms was the big story of the time as well, of literally going out of business as a result of it. And everyone said at the time, this cannot continue, that you have to see an impact because Britain imports so much food, it imports so much of everything, you must see this on shelves. They must realise that this is going to have a consequence. And now you are seeing it. Granted that the retailers were very well hedged for the last 12 months, but you're now seeing the implications of price inflation coming through to retail shelves. And that's hard won because negotiating with these retailers has been a very, very big challenge because the key play for retailers is consumer confidence. And whilst consumer confidence took a big hammering straight after the Brexit vote, what happened after that then is it increased somewhat, but it's continued to be negative. Now, there's some contradictions in these facts in that although the consumer confidence is low, consumer spending hasn't been hit yet, although you're now getting price inflation not matched to wage inflation, so there's increasing concerns over the future of spending in the UK. I'm not going to dwell too long on this slide because I think Catherine has given us a fantastic insight into the process ahead. But I guess from our perspective, whilst the political process is continuing, we've already felt the impact as a business, and our companies are feeling the impact as a business. And right the way through, we will be feeling it, and that's whether it's the volatility of currency, the difficulty of getting decisions made, the uncertainty of what the implications of those decisions will be, and I guess even most importantly, and Catherine has called this out, that transition period. What is it? What might it be? What could it be? What would we like it to be? Which obviously has a huge implication on all of us. Right the way through this, and when I came into the role, one of the first jobs that we felt was really important to do was make sure that Borbia as an organisation was strategically organised and relevant to this great crisis that we're facing. Because let it be clear, from our perspective, and I think from yours as well, we're viewing Brexit as the greatest strategic challenge our industry has ever faced. And then we revisited our strategy to ensure that it was relevant given this very changed backdrop. And having looked at, we were focused on consumer insight, we were looking at the infrastructure, the talent of the industry. We believed that Origin Green and our sustainability credentials would be the greatest differentiator that we could have when we were talking to our customers. Route to market would never be more important than it was, and communicating all of that story was really, really important. And having looked at those 5 pillars, our conclusion was it was as relevant post-Brexit as it was pre-Brexit. However, there were huge learnings for us in order to evolve that, and I'm going to come to that later in the presentation. But what did we do? So the news broke and there was a Brexit team established, and that Brexit team right from the beginning has been chaired on a weekly basis by the CEO, and that is my role to date. But what we actually have seen is that there's phases that are hitting us on Brexit, and phase 1 was almost like the emergency response unit that everybody just was crying out for data. Phase 2 now is we're collecting data, and we're now going to be walking into phase 3 where there's strategic choices that we all have to make and get prepared for. And let me just bring you through, perhaps very quickly, what those data places were. First of all, our first response. When everybody, that news broke, what was the big news? Well, from a company's perspective, it was exchange rate volatility. How do you manage it? What were your concerns? It was this risk of trade tariffs. No one, particularly in certain sectors like consumer foods, had even had to ever calculate a tariff before, and what was going to be involved in that. And then there was the risks that they were concerned on: customs, border controls, when would it happen, why would it happen, etc. And at that time, we created a 4-step plan for our response to it, which was around easing volatility, and I'll talk a little bit through each of these, getting much better at understanding our consumers, getting our customers in front of us, and expanding our reach into new markets. When we talked about that first response rate from easing volatility, and I won't go through all of these, but it was really focused on currency. How can we get better at managing our currency? How can we get better at managing our negotiations? And we increased our mentoring in order to do that, because that was the key, I guess, cause and consequence that we were facing at that time. And we were also then running our Brexit seminars both in Dublin and in London. But then we also looked at our consumers, and we intensified our research that was being undertaken by the Thinking House to understand, how did the British consumer react? How were they feeling? What was Northern Irish consumers doing? How could we see opportunities further afield, be that in private label? And what was the image of Ireland? How could we understand what was happening in the German and Italian market as we positioned our beef there? But we also then looked at further afield at markets in Iran, India, Japan, China, looking at the pig meat, looking at dairy opportunities, etc., to make sure that we were scoping out information all the way through. But most importantly, we felt all of the time we were not abandoning our UK position, or even worse, not paying attention to our Irish market, because 37% or €4 billion in exports was not something that we felt you could or should walk away from. So really what we were looking at then is top-to-top meetings, and with support from the Minister, we went and visited the senior management teams of the top 3 retailers in the UK. We then got further actions from that and commitments from them in order to understand how they were reacting to Brexit. But as importantly, as I said, doing something similar in the Irish market, because our market has an exposure now to cheaper imports from the UK, given that sterling benefit that they have, and obviously we don't in that period. And how do we make sure that we don't allow ourselves to get vulnerable in there? We're also then looking at our European and international positions, because clearly we have to up the ante on trade missions, and again with our partnership with the department of going into brand new markets, looking at North Africa, looking at the Gulf, looking at Asia, as recently as last week in the States and Mexico, looking at trade fairs. So we're at a trade fair a fortnight at this stage with 27 different shows this year, and then opening new offices in Warsaw and Singapore. But that's a lot of activity, and I guess what we wanted to make sure is that we weren't running blind. And phase 2 of that is where we started to then look at gathering data, and that data is your voice coming into it as well. And what we spent a lot of time doing, and we did this in partnership with PwC, and I wanted to specifically call out Mary Morrissey, who was the driving force behind this, supported by all of the sector managers in Board B as well. But we got the voice of 139 companies, Irish food companies, who were specifically exposed to the UK. And over 28 days, so from the end of March to the beginning of May, we gathered this data in quite an intense way. We called out from the beginning when we launched this back in March was that we did not want this to be just anonymously filled in for us online. We actually wanted to hear your voice. So we sat down with 65% of the companies, just under 90 of them, and our sector managers sat down and accompanied you through that. And it was really to make sure that we were gathering the conversations, the intelligence that was happening in the room. And we now have almost 15,000 pieces of data that we collected in a standardised format that we have a much, much better insight. And who was it that we were looking at, and what were we trying to collect? Well, basically we have 6 key topics, because after doing a number of pilots on this, we had eventually found out what were the key areas that people were worried about. And even now, and you see this in the course of the presentation today, it's route to market, supply chain, trade and currency are really the big call-outs here. But we had 17 subsections, 107 different questions to make sure that we had a breadth of conversation with yourselves from that. The win from the company's perspective was obviously they were getting a trigger from us that was calling out where their pressure points might be, where the green, red, amber zones were for them, so that they had to get further work from. And that was accompanied then from ourselves with signposting and data to say, where can you get that information? What's the next steps that we would advise you to take? So who did fill in this form? Well, those 139 companies, we divided out by sector as well because we wanted to make sure we had a strong voice from each of the sectors. And then we put in an estimate from a Borbia perspective of what that voice was of the exports that were going into the UK. So you can see that we've estimated, we've basically over 80% of dairy exports to the UK captured within this. We've got 70% of beef, 65% of pig meat. I'll specifically call out beverages at 10% because obviously that's very influenced by large multinationals in the export, and we don't have their voice within this. And similarly in prepared consumer foods at 50 to 65%, you have a number of very large multinationals who probably have a production unit in Ireland but not decision-making facilities in Ireland, and again their voice isn't within this one. But we do think that when you look at those figures and the ratios all the way through, we do have effectively the Irish food industry's voice by sector here. And similarly, when you're looking at the company size and who's filled in this, you've got a very, very strong range of companies with 33% of companies in the 10 to 50 million euro turnover range and 18% of the companies with 50 million plus turnover range. So this is not a small business survey, this is the Irish food industry coming out in force to give their voice and have that voice heard. When you look at the composition of their turnover then, 44% of that total turnover is on the Irish market and 56% of that is exported. Looking then at where that is exported to, you're seeing that 53% of those exports are going to the UK, so you're getting a very high exposure to the UK. And again, when you're looking at what route to market have they chosen, 83% food service, 81% retail, 44% food processing or manufacturing, and then you can see that 70% of respondents do both food service and retail. So what have we found out? Well, if I go through it in the sections, in the big sections, I wanted to lead with the route to market because when you look at route to market, there's some great news in there and there's obviously some challenges within that as well. When you're looking at it, first of all, respondents have said to us that they have strong trading relationships in the UK, and that's fantastic news and it's a great endorsement of where we're going or where we're coming from already. And similarly to that, they're saying that they're very optimistic about the outlook and opportunities to sell more products to the UK, which is again great news. And it's something that sometimes gets lost in all of the noise here, that our industry and the food industry, despite the huge challenges it's facing, is optimistic about the opportunity of doing new business in it. However, and this is the big part that we have to work and clearly call out on, is that when you're looking at the competitive insights that you need to have to compete to have this new business, well, you've got 64% of companies are saying that they have a UK-focused sales resource within the market, which is important, perhaps slightly low considering 100% of these guys are focusing on the UK market. But do you have a tailored marketing strategy for the UK? Only 39% of companies were able to answer that. And that's something that we definitely have to call out and work on, particularly when you realise that 85% of respondents know that their key competitor is in the UK. Similarly, when you're looking at alternate markets of do we go further than and outside of the UK, well, this is very much different by sector. Because when you're saying 79% of the respondents are already trading in the markets, but naturally some sectors have a much deeper penetration and a much larger level of experience than others within that. And particularly that's the case when you look at mushrooms, which will have 100% dependence effectively on the UK, versus meat, seafood and dairy, which will have a much broader footprint in the international markets. A key call out in this particular slide as well is that the prepared consumer food sector is an area that has to grow in this sector. It's not as strong in international markets, and it's similarly not as strong in the level of or the number of customers and the depth of their relationship with companies. And what their challenge has been is that feet on the street or understanding the route to market, and very often the language capability that goes behind that as well. The next big call out is supply chain. And supply chain, I think, is deceptively complex in this because you can give a very simple definition of to what supply chain is. And we've pulled one here to say it's the sequence of processes involved in the production and distribution of a commodity. Can't get much simpler than that, you might say, but this is the one that is probably the most difficult from a perspective of chunking it up or looking at it as an individual company, because this is where the real individual stories are being called out as well. But in an attempt to communicate it, we have chunked the data up, but with a health warning to say every company will have its own story, not just every sector, every individual company will have its own story in supply chain. One of the key places that supply chain is getting concerned on is the administration that's going to be coming into the supply chain. When you bring in customs, when you bring in any sort of administrative barrier, it makes that supply chain more complex and it increases the lead times. And the consequence of increasing the lead times is where the biggest play is, because we've over 10% of our companies here who say that they've got a shelf life of less than 7 days going into the UK. And obviously that's going to be an ultra fresh, you're looking at your mushroom industry, etc. So that anything that implicates or delays that product has a huge concern for that industry. And it goes right the way through that. But when it's not just about the quality of the product or the risk of spoilage with those delays, it's also on missing out on KPIs versus your competitors who may not have to experience those delays, particularly when you think back to that original figure of 85% of companies know their competitor is in the UK, then any delays or any increases in costs are going to have a huge impact. Similarly, 64% of our respondents said that their commercial models are sensitive to increases in lead times. So it's not just very short shelf life companies, and you also have issues of those who are transiting through the UK onto the continent as well. And as relevant, 88% of commercial models are moderately or highly dependent on low supply chain costs. And everything we're speaking about is talking about adding costs, that supply chain. And actually, that gets much worse. It goes up to 100% when you're talking about mushrooms, beef and lamb industries as well. And then you're looking at the supply chain across the route. So when you're looking at the relationship between the members of the supply chain, again, you've another story to tell. So 76% of respondents have stated that some of their supply chain relationships are strategic to their business. That goes up to the high or the 80s when you're looking at the dairy industry. And 68% of respondents are unsure as to whether their supply chain partners are Brexit ready. Again, that goes up to the 80s for the dairy industry. So there's some huge interdependencies that are here for a very integrated supply chain, and every part of that supply chain has to be ready for Brexit, not just the people who are sitting in this room. When you look then at customs and you're looking at the challenges, because there's huge trade, and part of the trade that goes between Ireland and the UK, and particularly Ireland and Northern Ireland, is actually probably not defined as trade, as we were hearing last night in the discussion. It's probably just closer to an integrated supply chain is the relationship that we have, particularly in the north. Yet, at the same time, you're going to have much more complexity around who does what on that supply chain, who is the designated importer, who takes on that role and responsibility, and who takes on that cost. And that's something that's going to be called out, perhaps not today, but in future contracts where these roles and responsibilities will more than likely be pushed down the supply chain rather than up. And similarly, when you're looking at that customs compliance, there's a whole area of experience. And when there's no experience, there is going to be delays because mistakes will be made. 46% of respondents have said they had limited to no experience of complying with the official requirements. And that gets higher when you're looking at the consumer foods industry specifically. Worryingly, but understandably, I think, 83% of respondents have not modelled the impact that tariffs are going to have on their UK business. Understandably, when you see the complexity of the multitude of different tariffs, particularly for the prepared consumer foods industry, when they're looking and challenged by this. VAT is another issue where you've got 80% of respondents hadn't considered any of the cash flow implications of VAT that's going to happen as a result of Brexit. And currency, I think, is probably obviously one of the most worrying ones, but one of the ones that we're most familiar with. We asked companies how are they coping with it at the moment, and many of them said at this stage they felt that they had well-developed practices for managing currency risk. But you can manage it all you like, but you're losing competitiveness every single time that it's turning on us. And when we looked at what level of sterling would you begin to have severe difficulties, you can see that 39% are at 85 to 89. We're at 88 today. We're looking at 80% of the industry when it's up at 90 to 94, and you've got 97% of the industry when it's between 95 and 99. Everyone keeps asking us who are the 1.5%, but we won't get distracted by those ones at the moment. But you can see there's a huge strong message here that as you go towards 1994p, 97% of the Irish food industry is going to be experiencing severe difficulties regardless of the management that they have. So effectively, you've got these key issues facing the industry. At the heart of everything is strong currency management, but it's your route to market, supply chain, non-tariff barriers and customs that are going to drive everything. I guess the key play for us is what are we doing about it now? And all of this is around leveraging the data. We have a huge amount of data, but we're gathering more as well, because as I said at the beginning, this is now looking at the individual company. We're building now this into sectoral perspectives and making sure that we understand where each of these goes from a sector and having the implications of it. But as importantly, we're now looking at the market prioritisation as well by sector, knowing what's possible, knowing where we should be going. And again, with additional funding given to us by the department, we've commissioned this research just in the last week to make sure that by September, we've got a roadmap of what sectors can see in what markets. Finally, and looking at that last phase that we're about to enter into, it's around the strategic imperatives that we have now to adopt. And from a Board Bia perspective, we've been gathering your data, we've been giving you information, but we ourselves are looking at our own organisation and making sure that we're fit for purpose. And looking again at those 5 strategic pillars, we're now looking at saying they're the right pillars, but how we implement them is absolutely key. And the big change that we're looking to create from ourselves is that route to market. You've called out to us in the course of the Barometer how important it is for you to be able to get new markets and how confident you are that it is the right thing to do, your products are suitable to it. But what we're now looking at is we've built, and thanks to this building, in some ways, a fantastic expertise and insight and a process behind our insight and innovation. We're now looking to do something very, very similar when it comes to route to market and creating a stage gate process for companies within that. Everything will always be built on the 5 pillars, but I guess there's 2 big steps that we feel we need to provide support on. Number 1 is the strategic development of companies as they choose what markets they're going to and why. And number 2 then is all around the implementation of that strategy. And if I was to break it down a little bit more, what we're really looking at is trying to help companies understand their get-to-market strategy and build on the insight, product and branding knowledge that they already have, but creating a much stronger link so that it's focused on the market all of the time, and then allowing that to be translated in market by product launch, etc. And what we'll be now doing is developing over the next weeks, is a best-in-class process to support you through this journey so that we've got a real planned and executed approach to it in a stage-gated model. So it's not a case of us tying you to Board Bia for the rest of your lives, but it's a case of giving you in-depth analysis on the spaces and the processes that you need to do to fulfill the ambitions that you clearly have. And again, very briefly, the timings on that is we'll have this process designed by August, piloted it during September and October with a ready for launch for January. But this will involve clearly a huge integration between our route to market structures and the thinking house and much more investment in the kind of insight that we're doing. But it also means that our toolkit with regard to the talent programs we have, be that on our fellowship where we're adjusting that now to have 2 projects instead of 4 projects, introducing an innovation fellowship program as well, and creating market programs. It just means that we're putting resources behind the decisions that you're looking to make. The second big imperative we're looking at is Origin Green, because as I flagged from the very beginning, we believe that this is the key differentiator that we're going to have as Ireland Inc. as you go to all of these new markets, as you build relationships with your customers. And what we're looking to do within that is put the structure behind it so that have all of the quality assurance schemes now translated into Origin Green schemes, and we'll be looking to have that achieved by the end of the year. But even more importantly, making sure that the public in Ireland know what we're doing on Origin Green, make sure that the producers in Ireland, and I'm talking on the farming community particularly, know what we're doing on Origin Green, and then finally look at harvesting the data that we've gathered from Origin Green to ensure that we're making claims for Ireland, claims for sectors and claims for individual companies that's backed with verified data as well. So we do believe that there's a new era ahead of us as we look to commercialise the opportunity that Origin Green is giving us. And again, we're looking to have a lot of this done by the end of December with our communications campaign to the general public in Ireland being launched for August of this year. And the final piece of this jigsaw is looking at ourselves as an organisation, because we can't look at the whole world changing ahead of us, the whole landscape and backdrop changing ahead of us, if we ourselves aren't open to that change as well. And we believe if we're going to strengthen ourselves and strengthen our organisation, we need to be able to put some new resources in. So what we're now looking to do is put real depth in the organisation and our investments behind 3 key areas: consumer insight, which I think you're mostly familiar with, Origin Green and sustainability, but also then look at route to market, because any expertise that we've looked at has told us that an organisation can't be brilliant at everything. It has to choose what it's going to be brilliant at. And we're choosing these 3 things because that's what we felt from talking to yourselves are the three things that are most important to you as well, which means that we need to put in additional resources into our markets. We need to put additional funding into those markets, but the advantage of that is the speed and agility that it'll allow us to operate again. So in closing, I guess, what I wanted to say is that there's huge challenges facing us. And as we look at those huge challenges, Brexit is not something that we would have chosen. But at the same time, it has provided us with a catalyst for change. And if we look at what that catalyst of change is going to do, then what we're going to be focusing on is the things we should be doing anyway. And the things that we should be doing anyway is building our innovation, building our capability, addressing our competitiveness, and making sure that we're as diversified as we possibly can be. So with the words of someone much brighter than me, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.